it's absolutely on the money there with everything you said. Now, my own just contribution, I mean, I heard the words mess and this kind of thing we mentioned there for the last couple of minutes. I think you actually find that for the powers that be that have actually orchestrated these wars, they've gone according to plan. I mean, I believe at this point in time that this is very much part of the plan. That the idea is to actually flood the area with weapons and create complete chaos, because it simply doesn't make any other sense apart from the fact that it is an orchestrated plan. I mean, the West have their hands all over this stuff, and one thing that strikes me, particularly in the media, is that we never hear a single word about the West's role in all of this. I mean, they've flooded the entire Middle East with weapons. They've been doing it for the last God knows how long. They were warned about this prior to the Iraq War, and it's played out exactly as all the people said it would. So, I mean, at this point in time, we can only conclude that it's very much part of the plan. And just another point I'd like to make is just with regards to ISIS. I mean, like that again, you never hear exactly where ISIS come from, but I mean, I've actually come to the conclusion that they're very similar to the Khmer Rouge that existed in Cambodia in the 1970s. The Khmer Rouge emerged from the carpet bombing of Cambodia by the CIA, and I think it was Pol Pot himself that actually admitted that prior to the bombing of the CIA, there was only a couple of hundred fighters, but by the end of the bombing campaign it had flooded to many thousands. And ISIS are a creation. I mean, make no mistake, it's a Frankenstein monster that the West has created at this point in time. And just the last point I'd like to make is just to do with Saudi Arabia. I know Richard mentioned Saudi Arabia, and I think that they have to be very much brought into this debate, because they are one of the richest powers in the Gulf state. And because they're an ally of the Western powers, we never hear a single word of criticism. That's something that needs to be obviously discussed in more detail.
Thank you very much. We had another question. We've just welcome our two people who have arrived from Portlaoise. Well done. So we'll just have a couple of more questions and then we'll call you to speak. Thank you. At the back, and Martin.
I mean, a lot of the people that have the arms manufacturing, well, I don't know what government can do about it, even if they want to say like in the Kenny. So what can the movement do to try to persuade people to take on the arms manufacturing? What can we do about it?
Thank you very much for that question. Martin.
Yeah, just actually come back on the arms manufacturing. Well, most arms companies wouldn't be in business if they weren't being supported by governments. Who are the biggest buyers of weapons? It's not some guy down the street buying F-16s, it's governments. So governments can very easily control arms companies, they can just stop buying them. Secondly, the whole idea that ISIS is kind of a plan or something in the middle of the West, I would have to disagree with that, because ISIS is it's contradictory to the West, because they can't really control it, and it becomes more and more progressively more expensive to get the oil out of these regions if you continue to obliterate any sort of stability in society, because you end up having to pay a huge amount just to secure your premises. And finally, the third one is the Irish anti-war movement has passed out standing order sheets, and I hope that people can actually sign them. If you don't have your bank details here, which is nice, you can sign the sheet and we can get back to you and fill out the remainder of the details later on, because we're always looking for money, and the other side has a lot of money and we don't have much.
Thank you. Now, I'd like to call on, we're very lucky actually to have two TDs here who have put their money where their mouth is as regards and going to the retail. I've already introduced Richard, but they who have really, over Shannon, made a huge stand, which we have yet to see what the result of that will be. So I think we need to stand behind them on that. So I'm going to call on Mick to speak first, if you wouldn't mind.
Well, I'm sorry I'm late, but we're in. You're probably told we were in Portlaoise Prison, and we were late getting out of it. But we're in for 4.5 hours, and we weren't expecting it there as long. But we weren't actually locked up now, but we were on human rights stuff. But anyway, I mean, I don't know what has been discussing and what aspect of. There's so many dimensions to the whole aspect of war, and I just heard that the arms industry we mentioned, which is obviously a big factor, and I think more so just, I promise I'm not going to talk very long, but I mean, I actually feel that more so than ever before, the drive of the industry itself has become a bigger factor than it used to be. You know, we were always familiar with large powers, colonial powers, wealthy countries, going to places and looking to control the mineral resources, be it oil or coal, tin, aluminium, whatever it was. And also, then that was probably advanced a bit. Obviously, before that, people used to go try and take territory, but it kind of advanced a bit where, in actual fact, the idea of getting McDonald's and Coca-Cola and whatever other businesses that were in their interest to expand, the urge and the want to actually expand themselves economically in these areas and be able to actually control the areas so that they can have an impact economically became a driving force. But given that the arms industry now has developed into one of the biggest industries on the planet, it is a huge driving force of its own. And you'll probably know that in the last 2 elections in America, Obama actually got more support from the arms industry than his Republican opponent, which was very interesting. And aside from that, now the 4 biggest contributors to the election funding, and it costs between $2 and $2.5 billion now to get elected in America. The 4 biggest contributors in the last 2 elections were arms industry, pharmaceutical, oil and coal. And I mean, that's a huge pressure on someone like Obama to deal with. And I mean, if he doesn't drop bombs on places, if he doesn't sell equipment to the likes of the Saudis and Qatar and UAE, if he's not doing that, then it's a huge problem for the industry at home. So there's a massive, massive pressure now to actually feed the industry itself. And it has led to a situation where I would safely say today that there has never been a time where there has been as much military activity, as much military destruction. There has never been as many bombs being dropped. There was a town there recently in Syria where they ran ISIS out of it. Sorry, it was actually Iraq, but they ran ISIS out of it. But they dropped nearly as many bombs on it as the British dropped on Dresden in the Second World War. It was unbelievable what bombs they dropped on it. Now they literally obliterated the place. Now ISIS left, but I mean, you're not going to beat ISIS by just bombing the cities that they occupied for a period of time. And I mean, it's just gone off the Richter scale. And the idea, I think it's probably never been as easy to make the argument, an anti-war argument. We have 60 million people displaced in the world at the last count about 12 months ago. 33 million of them have actually been displaced by war. 33 million have been displaced by war. And as the point that we've been making in the Dáil, how in God's name can our government say that they're actually concerned about the refugees that are drowning in the Mediterranean and ones looking for asylum in Europe? How can they say they care about it if we still allow Shannon to be used as a US military airbase? Because that's what it is. It's a military base. And it's actually very strategic to them at this stage. It's worth its weight in gold to them. How can we continue to give permits to civilian aircraft to overfly with any munitions of all types that they want? We give permits on a daily basis to them to carry across on civilian planes. They've come in on the military planes, which they won't inspect, which are allowed to land in Shannon, but the civilian ones, they can land with the troops and with their personal guns, but they're allowed to overfly irrespective of what sort of hardware, military hardware, is on board. And I mean, if we say that we actually care about the refugees, would you think that we might stop actually facilitating the war effort? Would you think that we would stop facilitating such absolutely unwanted destruction? But I mean, people ask, okay, what can we do about the arms industry in America? And listen, it's very difficult to do anything, but listen, there was we would have had a notion that we were a neutral country one time. The government still says we are, but it isn't true. Right? But if we were a neutral country, we could actually have a voice. We could actually say, you know what, we don't think this is great, and that this is a bad idea. We don't think it's great to just keep dropping bombs on people's houses. You kill half of them and you make refugees of the rest of them. We don't think that that's fair. And it doesn't solve any problems, but it creates unbelievable multiples of problems. We can't, I mean, if we made a position and took the stand and said, you know what, we're not going to allow military planes land in Channel anymore, because the Irish people actually don't like the idea of bombs being dropped on people's homes in other regions. We don't like the idea of plane loads of munitions being allowed to fly over our country because of the destruction that they cause. And that's something that we do have an impact over. That's something that we can try and do in Ireland. I admit that we can't change how the arms industry is actually working in America and the pressure it's putting on the government to actually escalate war everywhere it can. But we can at least take a position ourselves, one of neutrality, and go back to the idea of being neutral.
You know, Mick, can I just ask you, you say we can, but why haven't we done it? We're supposed to be a neutral country. What is the impediment to us? I mean, what, 60, 90 people here? What is the impediment to the Irish people actually invoking the neutrality? And why is Enda Kenny so quick? I'm asking you as somebody who's in the door. I mean, okay, I'm not an advocate of Enda Kenny or any of them, but he can't be 190% a bad man. What is the issue? What really is the issue? That's what I'd like to know.
Well,
maybe because as the inside you'd know.
Would it be better if you came back
Okay,
over
sorry.
here, maybe and then we'll... So Claire, if you'd just like to speak now.
I'll answer
Yes,
that.
and
Claire can answer. No. Yeah, I mean, look, I just deal with a couple of things. Again, we don't know what was discussed before we came here. We're very conscious of not repeating points, but maybe I'll just dwell on bits and pieces in terms of Shannon and what we can do. Because even though the arms industry is an international industry, Ireland is not involved in that process, if you like. Only this morning we were discussing in the Dáil the issue of the fact that the Department of Jobs on an annual basis gives hundreds of export licenses to military list items, many of them to countries the likes of Saudi Arabia and Israel, for which there isn't a problem for. Syria is on the sort of problem list, but actually Saudi Arabia and Israel aren't. And that is a multi-million euro industry that operates in Ireland and is something that we could put pressure on. I think it is the case that there has been an incredibly fluid interpretation of our neutrality. They say it's for historic reasons, our special relationship with the United States, but the reality behind that is that that was an arrangement that was in place years ago when garrison troops during the Cold War used to come stop over in Ireland on their way back to Germany or wherever they were going to, you know, sit around in Cold War times. That then became distorted after Iraq, and despite the magnificent movement of people power, which didn't stop the Irish government being complicit in the Iraq war, that changed everything. And basically since then, on a consistent basis, the Irish governments, successive ones, have allowed Shannon to be used. And it's a bit like the way they deal with abortion. It's an Irish solution to an Irish problem. We'll call it neutrality, but sure, then we'll do what we can for the lads behind the scenes. And the figures are there. I mean, how mad is it that they say that military aircraft are allowed pass through Ireland, but only on the strict condition that they are unarmed, not carrying munitions, weapons or explosives, and are not engaged in any intelligence gathering and not taking place in any military exercises or operations. Now, there's about 2 of them land in a day. They're not cheap to fly over on that. So if they're not doing any of those things, what in God's name are they doing? Big problem. But then in a contradictory way, they say for civilian aircraft, they are allowed to carry any amount of stuff you like, as long as you look for a permit for that. Any munitions for the troops, and of course soldiers themselves, as fighting combatants, are themselves a weapon in a situation. So we had last year over 600 permissions, almost 2 a day, for military aircraft to land, supposedly doing nothing and carrying nothing, and then civilian aircraft transited 55,000 US troops, again on civilian aircraft, with permits in many cases for the guns and ammunition to be under deck. Not only that, we know from Freedom of Information released for last year, there were a whole number of overflights given permission and indeed landings. Some of them to Saudi Arabia, some of them carrying weaponry and explosives, which when you take off the jargon from could have been used in the making of cluster bombs, which we all know are illegal and which we all know that Saudi Arabia is using in Yemen. That could have transited overland in Ireland. How do we know? Because we don't allow searches to take place. 190 metric tons of explosives going on the way to Afghanistan. We know materials that went to Iraq previously were captured and used by ISIS. Why not in Afghanistan as well? And as Mick said, who cares? Because at the end of the day, for the arms industry, that's great, because then they're just going to need to get more to plug the gap of the ones that went out. And the problem is that Ireland has consciously operated, Tom Clonan called it a virtual forward airbase for the US military, but the WikiLeaks cables give a very clear view of how the Americans view it. And I mean, I won't bore you, but they talk about Shannon Airport being an important gateway for US commercial and military travel. They talk about Shannon remaining a key transition point for US troops and materials bound for theatres of war in the global war on terror. They talk about the United States government appreciating Ireland's steadfast support in permitting US military transits which backstop US actions in the Gulf region. And we know from evidence given that in our trial in Ennis earlier this year for trying to search the aircraft, and I would say we didn't do that lightly or just, as people said, just for the crack. That came after 3 years of Dáil questions seeking information, 2 government ministers, the former Minister for Justice and Eamon Gilmore, saying, well, of course, if what you're saying is true, like that these aircraft are carrying something, my God, we would act on that evidence, but we've no evidence to say that that's the case. But sure, of course they haven't, because they never went and looked for it. And when we pointed out the evidence, and it was given at the trial, we're actually producing a book of the trial, it'll hopefully come out after Christmas, but people like Tom Clonan gave evidence to say about being on an aircraft and the announcement coming over, lads, leave your weapons under the chairs when you're disembarking, and all of that. We know from airport workers who gave evidence of seeing guns on aircraft. We had an airport worker who was arrested for stealing a gun off a US aircraft, and obviously how that could be, it never went to trial, because how could he be guilty of stealing something that wasn't there? So that never happened, but he gave evidence at the trial, and that's what you're talking about. 4 government departments kicked this issue around in circles. Department of Transport covered the permits on civilian aircraft. Department of Foreign Affairs can be consulted. If somebody gives out and asks for permission to have the aircraft searched, the guards are called out, Department of Justice. Then the Department of Defence go out and guard them. So when we ask, you're sent from Fitzgerald to Flanagan, back to Pascal Donoghue and around the garden path. So it's a fudge. It's an Irish complicity fudge that they do on all issues. And that's why I think it's really important that we highlight it. I mean, it is something, it's not surprising that Ireland appeared on ISIS's list, and while we wouldn't sensationalise it in the way in which the gutter press would or anything like that, that's nothing new. We know from journalists previously that people in the Middle East have said they're not really impressed with Ireland, who declares its neutrality, allowing itself to be used by the Americans. That's on record by organisations before, and in fairness you wouldn't blame them. Like they have a point, like we are complicit and we have the words there for that. So we think Shannon is critically important. It's a weak point of the government. I mean, it's a little bit sickening that, you know, the Greens when they were in opposition, Labour when they were in opposition, they do better speeches than we could ever make up about why this was an important issue, and then they go into government and they don't care about it. And we have another government coming up soon, and we need to put pressure on that will be, I mean, that will be an absolute red line issue for us, for example, in terms of getting this stopped. But the pressures, they say it's jobs and industry and not upsetting the Americans. But sure, we know that a lot of Americans believe exactly as we do, and they'd be far more feel far more solidarity with the Irish government if they got their corporations to pay their taxes at home and invest in services in America rather than providing an air base there. So look at, I mean, I do think we can play a role in that. We can pressure our government about the trade that we do in facilitating arms and linking up, but also in Shannon. I mean, isn't it really sickening? You see these backbench government deputies getting up now and saying, and their response to the horror is cut down on civil liberties, more security, more surveillance, when in actual fact the best step forward would be to invoke a positive neutrality and to engage and put ourselves on the stage of peace and so on. So look at that, that's what we're about. We don't know what's happening with our own case. we were down surveying the accommodation today to see, but again, maybe ISIS have done us a favour that it's maybe less likely now that we'd be incarcerated in the short term, because it would be a deep irony actually if that was the case, that parliamentarians who had used their position to try and get the evidence were told to basically go and get it, and then you're kind of being done for that. So look, we're delighted to be here, and it is great to see people organising on this. The horrors of Paris have brought home the nightly horrors that happen in the Middle East to people in Europe who had the luxury of being able to ignore it. And the best tribute we can give to the innocent victims in France or Lebanon or Syria or wherever they're from is that we would be active in a movement like this and in campaigns for peace on a global scale and against the arms industry, and that I suppose is the task faced by all of us tonight.